So I'll take a slightly different detour and come back to the more boring world of enterprise. Apparently it's very profitable. About 2009, we put together this company called Actifio. And today, this morning, if you think about somebody called Actifio talking about culture, probably this might come to your mind. This moves forward even better. There you go. I've heard this many times. People have asked me about the culture and said, what's the secret here? I'm Ashutosh. I'm the CEO of Actifio. It's a company that delivers radically simple copy data storage. For those interested, I'll talk about it afterwards. Really what I wanted to spend some time today and get a little feedback from you folks is about an experience and a journey that we are well underway in. And talk a little about one of the most, probably always referred to, often attempted, and rarely done well in the entrepreneurship world. This is about culture. And how this plays such a significant role as we go along the company's path and go back and look at what it really means to us, to me personally, and to my company at Keynote. I think many of us pretty much think about the old adage that change is the only constant. And I'm going to try to stay here so I don't get the level of exercise Brian gets. Change is the only constant, but even more importantly, we figured out that the velocity of this change is also the one constant. It seems to be just increasing all the time. And entrepreneurs among us here love change. Is there anybody who doesn't like change? That's what we said, right? And this is the opportunity. We look forward to this. We look forward to finding the disruptions in the market. And we really come back and find this as an opportunity for us to come back and do something completely different than what the incumbents have done. And you come back and look at Gary Hamel, probably one of the foremost business thinkers, in an article in HBR, talks about how companies adopt changes, and there are three kinds of companies across the board. I don't know if this is explains all that. And when they talk about there's three categories. There are the rule makers. These are the guys who are incumbents. These are the folks who dominate the industry. Their entire sole purpose here is to protect that incumbency. In my market, that would be EMC, Network Appliance, Symantec, other companies, probably airlines like American Airlines. These are the guys who dominate. They paid their dues, they created a phenomenal company, and they run the rules. And then there are the rule takers. These are the guys, these are the idiots. They try hard. They want to be the best number two possible. There's a lot of them in that category. And in my market, there's a company called Combot that does that. Several airline companies around the game. And then there are the rest of us. And you completely break the rules, you look at the opportunities, you look at the change, you thrive on disruption, and you come back and embrace it. And truly come back and disrupt what used to be the rule takers and rule makers market. And that's an exciting process in the innovation and entrepreneurship across the board. And what we look at in this entire process is as we take on these big companies, as we take on the incumbents, we couple markets that are very conventional. You go back and do inbound marketing as opposed to TV ads. You go back and look at a better way to create how you bring your customers and get them happy. That is an exciting feeling. There's a time in the company stage where you feel like there's nothing that can stop you. There's an evolution of challenges that have been knocked out. And you feel like a teenager. You feel like one of those guys who knows everything, can take on everything. And it's exhilarating. It's beautiful. That's kind of where we were about a year ago. company that could stop. Then one day, something happens. That little beanbag we're sitting down, having fun at, suddenly we have customers. We have partners. We have employees. They ask for org charts. You're working on dashboards. Predictability becomes more important than individual acts of heroism. People start to say, hey, you're not a startup anymore. You are a grown-up. And you really want to start figuring out how you evolve everything around the company to help you make this transition. And this is a tough transition. This is a time when you really start to figure out what happened to those wonderful days. When I could just go back and look at every opportunity, go back and tackle everything down. I would deploy these wonderful individuals who would just take down the big armies. And yet, I'm now more focused on being more predictable. And what's interesting is just a case study of where we are as a company today. This is the best scenario of what Actifio is all about, to give you a context of the kind of changes that has gone through. It's a fascinating story we have. It is the fastest growing storage company ever. We've had about 11 consecutive quarters of triple-digit growth. We've gone up and been a global company from the beginning. We sell in 18 countries. We have over 200 partners. Half our revenue comes from outside the U.S. We come back and tackle over $44 billion of a market that is targeted towards the enterprise IT and the service provider market. It's not a bad thing for a company less than 4 years old. This July, actually, we celebrate our first 4-year anniversary. But this doesn't come with its own costs. And that's the part that we want to talk a little more about. It was a wonderful little company that we used to have in a data center in a basement with about 80 people. Suddenly it becomes 220 people. Those little airline fractures that were ignored because you could just walk over have now expanded enough to become big chasms that we start to worry about crossing over. And then you come back and say, well, what does that mean, across the board? And as in my company or yours, that wonderful thing that we all adopted, that we loved so much, change, well, apparently that starts to affect us. That wonderful change is no longer your friend anymore. Everything that we know changes. You look at what happens and what we made assumptions on. In terms of people, in terms of this presentation that doesn't change as fast as I want it to. This is the entrepreneur's problem. All right. Let me go use the old. Sometimes the old-fashioned way of clicking it works better. So there's all kinds of change going on all the time. Economy changes, people change, everything changes, and yet you realize that the value you created up to this stage is a lot smaller than the durable value that you create going forward. And if you look at one of probably the argument the best, the most legendary investor across the board, it's not just the creation of advantage that's value, it's the fact that you can create a durable advantage, a sustained advantage. And that's the challenge from a startup perspective or an emerging company perspective, trying to get to the next stage that you constantly deal with. And what that means is if there's so much of change going on, people change, everything around you changes, what exactly does it? How do you find a way to continue to grow and keep that same passion around? And I think the answer lies in a very simple thing. Like I said, everybody talks about it. A lot of people attempt it, and very few get it right. And it's this culture. And it's not, when I talk about culture, it's not about the usual platitude, we value our employees, of course, who doesn't? We absolutely love our customers. Yeah, we do. Or we have free coffee, or we have shoes, and of course, all that is wonderful stuff. But that's not the point we're talking about. We're talking about a culture that takes what entrepreneurs used to do, take the limited resources that you had in the early stages. Remember those early stages? You captured that change. You had limited resources. You had few guys. You worked on them. You prioritize those resources, and went out and won the battle with Goliath. Well, it's now about prioritizing the actions that require you to take a sustained way of deploying the resources over time. So we look at culture as literally about figuring out a way to come back and create actionable value priorities, not just a platitude that we all love to put on a coffee room. What does that mean? It means a lot of things. It's really about a few things, a few resources and actions you take, and you start prioritizing. It's about focus. You focus on breadth. You focus on breadth, and on a few things, or focus on a lot more things. You focus on the journey. You focus on destination. You focus on a transaction. There are some markets where a single transaction is enough because your customer might buy only once. And there are other places like mine where it's just a sustained engagement. My users just start for the first time and engage with us for 10 years. And sometimes it is about focusing on customer sat versus a short-term profitability. Again, a lot depends on the individual, a lot depends on the individual circumstances and the market itself. And that brings up a very important point. I think we all look at and learn from some of the best companies from the culture perspective, but every company has its own culture and has to create one. I think this is a wonderful lesson. You almost have to go through this process to come back and realize what works for you. Let me take our example. We are an enterprise data management company. So we sat down and said, what's changed in this market? What works for us? 3 big trends have come in, swooped this market around. There's a whole notion of commoditization of IT. How many of you buy? In fact, some of you may have seen the results of IBM last quarter. You will soon see results of the larger companies like HP. The whole story around Dell. There is a huge shift on commoditization of IT. Nobody buys servers from the large companies anymore. They probably go to Amazon. So the next big trend on the cloud side. But the other big wave that swept our market, again, the enterprise market, is this entire consumerization of IT. The need for simplicity, the need for quality. No more am I going to tolerate you guys deploying a box that takes 6 months to make it work, another 3 years of consulting fee to get it all run. I need something that works because my iPhone works, my iPad works, most of my stuff is more sophisticated than my data center works. So why is it you guys are stuck in this? So we look at these key phases and we come back at those data points and figure out what's the culture that works for us. So number one, if truly it's about commoditization of IT, it's commoditization of technology, what really works is the ability to come back and deliver something that the user wants. Of course, it's pretty obvious. But it's not that obvious if you think about it. If you come back and make that the cornerstone saying, before I start a company, I actually want to spend a ton of time figuring out what I'm going to go build with the help of a bunch of users. Because the technology, pretty much, you can build most everything you can. You need to. We spent a good 46 users' time for about 8 months before incubating Actifio, and they have become an integral part of the entire journey for us. We absolutely focus on this customer-centric attitude for the company. Second, if there's so much of shift going around, and we're counting on the underlying platform for us to constantly change, and this is just the beginning of the journey in the enterprise market, there's more to come, then we need people who absolutely are mature enough to come back and make the shift. And I'm proud to say average age at Actifio is about 42. Partly because we need a level of seasoned expertise to adapt to the change, to be able to be grounded pretty heavily in the domain itself. That was absolutely important for us to come back. Another big shift for us as part of the cloud is if my buyers, who used to buy from Dell, HP, IBM, suddenly move towards buying from Amazon, Verizon, Time Warner, I have to figure out how I can put our products into that market as opposed to the old market. That's a big shift again. And these became an embedded part of what we formulated as the Actifio culture. And I want to share with you what that is today. At the core, and we are absolutely good at this one, and we do an incredible job of being very, very, very customer-centric. And Jit is here on my floor. He'll tell you that I spend way too much money on customer side. but it is reflective upon how we compensate the executive team. Much of our compensation depends on this thing called NPS, Net Promoter Score. And Net Promoter Score, for those, how many of you know Net Promoter Score? Perfect. We did the first one. Our target was 25% because the market needed it at 40%. Apple is about 25. We came out at 62. Very first year. We want to get to 75 before end of this year. And it's not because we love to keep our customers just happy. It's because it's the only way to create a sustainable business for our market. We would love to have a transaction and go from there to take the next one. But we know these are the people who start with 300,000, get to 5 million, get to 10 million from us. And it's important to drive the customer centricity. And that's just on the front end of the process. It translates all the way back. Every week, 3 to 5 users come to our office to work with engineering team, not with the sales team, work with the engineering team to constantly keep helping us redefine this part. And it's back to the same old part. If you get to the customer centricity as a fundamental culture of the company, it pervades every facet, not just the sales part of the process. And that's very, very important for us. And then you have to go back and look at hiring phenomenal people. We're selling in 18 countries. I've got folks all over the world. And there's no way we can have that kind of a growth without people who are absolutely accountable, which means they're heavily responsible. They have the ability to come back and make the decisions for the company in a consistent form, independent of the geography, independent of the time zone. And accountability is pretty high. We pretty much measure and monitor almost every aspect of the company, right down to individual. And which is a real strength for an enterprise company, but it's the only way for us to come back and scale up. Once you hire phenomenal people, it's not really hard to get to the third part of it. But it is really important to do it. And I think best example of what we've taken to heart, what it really means to hire people. We've had my marketing person, CMO, Mike Roy, one of the best marketing guys probably in the world. It took us 2 years to fill that position. We would rather have no bread than have bad bread. We took that to heart. We absolutely took that to heart to come back and say, it will take a lot of time to bring the appropriate person, because if you don't do that, then all you're doing is getting to a point where when the company scales, you could have something so badly broken that it's much harder to go fix. And this is really important. And then coming back to consumerization, we focus a lot on quality, a lot on excellence in results, and it's every facet, not just, again, beautiful product and very simple to use, works all the time. There's also the way we engage with you, and how we want to come back and have the experience of working with Actifio to be excellent. The way our sales guys engage, the way they provide the pricing, the way they engage with the post-sales. That whole notion is that somebody thinks about Actifio, they think about two things. It's radically simple, and boy, they're an outstanding company to work with. I think this became a cornerstone of the culture, but more importantly, we've driven this from day one. We put it upon hard to make it a part of the program, make it a part of the new hire program, constantly recognize people based on making sure this thing happens. We've fired people who have done this. It's as important. It's not just important enough to reward folks who have done it, but we have to come back and make it a very obvious choice when you don't do this process. So you come back to this whole story of what culture is all about. And if you come back and talk about the wonderful change we had and we took as an opportunity, created a phenomenal company, to create a sustained approach here, culture absolutely survives founders. We look at some of the best companies around. IBM just finished 100 years of IT company, probably the only one. It survives well past the founders. It survives brand. It survives all kinds of changes. It allows people to make decisions that are consistent with what the company wants across the board, across time, across geography. So it must be pretty simple, right? So you start a new company, you come out with a wonderful culture. It must be pretty simple to come back and say, once I have the culture, I'm going to build a company that's 100 years old. And so while it's the only enduring way to scale, the big question for us is this the only answer, right? Is this the end of it? Culture is enduring. Culture is one that changes less over time. But it's very important to identify that culture is not immutable. Remember that friend changed? That comes back to affect human culture. So the ability for us to constantly keep looking at culture also as something that changes is probably the toughest part to put on the phone. And probably the biggest opportunity now. If you look at some of the best run companies, these are the ones that evolve from do whatever it takes, phase one, to do something that absolutely scales, phase two, constantly keep looking at disruption and innovation from other guys like me 5 years ago. And this is an evolution that we are going through. I want to share that with you as an emerging company, as somebody who's going through it on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And something that I think all of you, many here have done a phenomenal job of transitioning through this entire process. But something that's pretty often neglected and takes a ton of time. I mean, I have Mr. Sen on my board who's done an enormous job taking it right from the very beginning, focusing on this based on his experience. So we'll stop here. Thank you for the time. If there's any questions, I'd love to talk to you about another wonderful thing that we do as a product, like the stuff that we encountered at the process of transition.